He chose to disappear, and in disappearing, he changed everything. There is a name most people in the church have never heard, not because the work was small, not because the fruit was absent, but because the man behind the work made a decision early in his life, a decision that cost him everything the world considers worth having. And he made it quietly, without applause, without an audience, and without regret. His name was Thomas Hector Drummond. He was born in 1887 in a small stone farmhouse outside Brantford, Ontario, the second of 5 children raised by a Scottish Presbyterian father who believed in hard work, cold mornings, and very little sentiment. The winters in that part of Ontario were the kind that got into your bones. Thomas learned early what it meant to endure something without complaining about it. That lesson would serve him for the rest of his life. His father, William Drummond, was not a cruel man, but he was a distant one. He ran the farm like a machine and expected his children to be parts of it. There were prayers before meals, brief, formal, mechanical. God was acknowledged the way the weather was acknowledged, as a fact of life that one worked around. Thomas grew up understanding that God existed. He just never understood, in those early years, that God was near. The event that changed that came on a Tuesday night in October of 1901, when Thomas was 14 years old. A traveling evangelist had set up a tent revival just outside Brantford. Thomas went not because he was seeking anything. He went because his school friend had dared him to, and because the walk was short, and because there was nothing else to do on a Tuesday night in rural Ontario in October. He sat in the back row. He intended to leave early. He did not leave early. The evangelist that night was not polished. He was not eloquent in the way that word is usually meant. But something came through him that Thomas had no vocabulary for. The man spoke about a God who was not merely acknowledged but known, a God who was not a fact of life to be worked around, but a Father to be encountered. Thomas sat very still in the back row for a very long time. And when the invitation came, he did not walk forward dramatically or weep visibly. He simply sat with something happening inside him that he could not explain and could not undo. He walked home alone that night under a black Ontario sky, shot through with stars. He did not tell his father. He did not tell anyone. But something had shifted in him at a molecular level, and nothing that followed was ever quite the same. The next decade of Thomas Drummond's life was not spectacular. This is important to say. When we tell the stories of great men and women of faith, we tend to skip from the conversion moment to the ministry moment, as if the years between are merely a hallway one passes through on the way to significance. But the hallway, as it turns out, is where the character is built. The hallway is where the roots grow down before the branches grow up. Thomas spent those years reading. He read his Bible with the same deliberate intensity his father brought to the farm. He read church history, missionary journals, the testimonies of men and women who had walked into places of danger, carrying nothing but the name of Jesus. He took a job at a printing press in Brantford after finishing school, setting type by hand, learning the mechanical grammar of words on paper. He did not know yet why he needed to know how a press worked. He would know later. He married in 1912. Her name was Clara Josephine Baird, the daughter of a Methodist minister from Hamilton. She was precise where Thomas was expansive, practical where he was visionary, and completely unintimidated by the size of his ideas. Clara was the kind of woman who did not need to be in the room to be in the room. Her thinking shaped every major decision Thomas made for the rest of his life. And she is almost entirely absent from the historical record, which tells you a great deal about both her character and the character of the age she lived in. They moved to a small rented house in Hamilton. Thomas took a position assisting a local pastor with correspondence and church administration, work that was unglamorous in the extreme. He answered letters. He organized records. He drafted bulletins. He learned in those years how an institution actually functions from the inside, which is to say, through 10,000 small acts of invisible faithfulness that no one sees and no one celebrates. And then, in 1919, he heard the name that would reshape the direction of his life. The man's name was Elijah Marsh. He had been preaching in rural communities across Western Canada, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the Peace River region of Alberta, and the reports coming back were the kind that made cautious people uncomfortable and hungry people desperate. The blind were seeing, the deaf were hearing. a woman in a farming community outside Saskatoon, who had been unable to walk for 7 years, stood up in the middle of a meeting and walked home. There were documented accounts. Documented. Thomas noted carefully, not just testified, of people healed of tuberculosis, of cancers that disappeared between one medical examination and the next. Thomas read these reports with the same careful attention he brought to everything. He did not dismiss them. He also did not accept them uncritically. He wrote letters. He tracked down corroborating witnesses. He corresponded with local physicians in the towns where the meetings had occurred. What he found did not answer every question, but it was enough. He wrote to Elijah Marsh in the autumn of 1919. The letter he received back was not what he expected. He had expected either a grand invitation or a polite dismissal. What he received instead was 3 handwritten pages of raw, unguarded honesty. Marsh wrote about the meetings, yes. He wrote about the healings, yes. But he also wrote about the chaos. The crowds were growing beyond what anyone could organize. The testimonies were coming in faster than anyone could document them. Fraudulent healers had begun attaching themselves to the periphery of the revival, muddying the witness. Newspapers were printing distortions, and Marsh himself. Marsh wrote this with a plainness that Thomas found unexpectedly moving. Was a man who could stand in front of 10,000 people and see miracles happen through his hands, and who had absolutely no idea how to write a letter, organize a schedule, or prevent the whole thing from collapsing under its own weight. Thomas showed the letter to Clara. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the kitchen table and looked at her husband for a long moment. "You know what this is," she said. It was not a question. He did know. He had known, probably, from the first paragraph. They sold the furniture. They packed what remained into 2 trunks. They said goodbye to their church in Hamilton and to Clara's father, who prayed over them, with the particular combination of pride and worry that is the exclusive domain of ministers' fathers. They took the train west in February of 1920, into the kind of cold that Canada reserves for the month it most wants you to know it is serious. What Thomas stepped into was not, in the romantic sense, glorious. The meetings were held in whatever space was available. Grain warehouses, skating rinks, the occasional proper church that had agreed to open its doors. The organization, as Marsh had promised, was essentially non-existent. There were no systems for follow-up with the people who had responded to the gospel. There was no documentation process for the healings that would survive serious scrutiny. There was no correspondence management, no scheduling system, no method for distinguishing the legitimate itinerant ministers attaching themselves to the movement from the ones who were simply following the crowds for their own purposes. Thomas looked at all of this and did not feel overwhelmed. He felt, for the first time in his life, exactly suited to the task before him. He began building. He built quietly and without fanfare, the way a craftsman works, with attention to the next small thing rather than the finished picture. He designed a system for recording testimonies: date, name, nature of the condition, name and contact information of attending physician if applicable, follow-up correspondence 3 months later. He wrote form letters and correspondence templates. He created a scheduling framework that allowed Marsh to accept speaking engagements without double booking or leaving communities without follow-up support. He negotiated with local church leaders on Marsh's behalf, smoothing the tensions that inevitably arose when a national revival movement moved through a local congregation's territory. And he rose every morning at 4 o'clock. This is not a detail for rhetorical effect. It is simply what Thomas did. Every morning at 4, in whatever borrowed room or rented space they were occupying in whatever town the meetings had moved to, Thomas Drummond got up in the dark and spent 2 hours in prayer before the day's work began. Clara would sometimes hear him through the wall. Not the words, but the low, steady rhythm of a man in earnest conversation with someone he trusted absolutely. He never talked about this publicly. It would have embarrassed him to do so. But those who worked closely with him noticed something they struggled to articulate: that he carried a quality of stillness into the middle of chaos. That decisions made under pressure seemed to come from somewhere deeper than strategy. That when things went wrong, and things went wrong constantly, in the way that things always go wrong in large movements of people and spirit and logistics, Thomas did not panic and did not despair, but simply went back to the problem with a steadiness that felt, to those around him, like something that had been cultivated over a very long time in a very private place. The revival moved. Thomas moved with it, west, and then east and then south, into the United States, where Marsh's reputation had crossed the border ahead of him. There were meetings in Minnesota, in Missouri, in the tent meeting corridors of the American South, where the hunger for something real was almost physical in its intensity. In 1923, something happened that tested everything Thomas had built. A man named Gerald Fitch began holding his own meetings on the edge of Marsh's circuit, claiming a healing ministry and explicitly invoking Marsh's name and reputation to attract crowds. Fitch was persuasive, theatrical, and entirely fraudulent. Thomas discovered this through the correspondence network he had spent 3 years building. A letter from a physician in Tulsa who had examined 3 of Fitch's supposed miracle cases and found nothing to substantiate the claims. Then another letter from a pastor in Memphis. Then another from a church elder in St. Louis. Thomas took the evidence to Marsh. Marsh wanted to ignore it. He was not a dishonest man, but he was a man in the middle of something vast and luminous, and the shadow that Fitch was casting felt, to him, like a distraction from the light. Thomas sat with him for 3 hours in a small office in Kansas City and made the case, quietly and methodically, that silence was not protection but complicity. That the credibility of everything real depended on their willingness to publicly distinguish it from everything fraudulent. Marsh issued a public statement. Thomas wrote it. It cost them. Several of the larger meeting venues that had been planning to host Marsh canceled. A segment of the press that had been cautiously supportive pulled back. For several months in late 1923 and early 1924, it looked as if the institutional momentum of the revival might not survive the controversy. It survived, and when it did, it survived with something it had not fully possessed before: a reputation for honesty in a field where honesty was not always the primary currency. The documentation Thomas had spent 3 years building became, paradoxically, the thing that made the miraculous claims survivable in public discourse. Because there was a paper trail. Because there were names and dates and medical correspondences and follow-up letters. Because someone had cared enough about the truth to insist on keeping records of it. The revival grew. Marsh grew with it. And Thomas Drummond continued doing what he had always done, in the background, at 4 a.m, with his correspondence files and his scheduling systems, and his quiet, steady, entirely invisible faithfulness. By 1929, the year the stock market collapsed and took the economic certainties of a generation down with it, Marsh's ministry had touched hundreds of thousands of lives across North America. Thomas had been at the center of every logistical decision that made this possible. He was not mentioned in newspaper accounts. He was not recognized from platforms. When Marsh gave interviews, he answered questions about the healings and the crowds and the spiritual hunger of the age, and Thomas's name did not come up, and Thomas did not expect it to. But something had been growing in Thomas's mind during those years, separate from the revival work, taking shape slowly the way ideas take shape when they are allowed to develop without urgency. He was watching what happened after the revivals moved on. This was the thing no one was talking about. The meetings came, the Spirit moved, the healings happened, people wept and believed and were transformed. And then the meetings ended, and the tents came down, and the traveling ministers moved on to the next city, and the new believers were left behind in communities that frequently did not know what to do with them, in churches that were unprepared to disciple them, and in many cases drifted into nothing within a year. Thomas had seen this pattern in city after city, documented in his follow-up correspondence that almost no one else was reading. He understood that revivals without infrastructure were fires without hearths, beautiful, briefly, and then cold. He began writing. He had the press skills from his years in Brantford. He had, by this point, years of correspondence and testimony documentation that amounted to an enormous archive of the revival's history. He began producing a newsletter, modest at first, 4 pages, mimeographed, mailed, to a list of several hundred ministers and church leaders who had encountered the revival and wanted to remain connected to it after it moved on. He called it The Witness. Clara wrote most of the editorial content in the early years, though her name did not appear on the masthead. This, too, is simply what it was. Thomas knew it, and she knew it, and neither of them spent energy performing gratitude at each other when there was work to be done. The Witness grew. Within 3 years, it was reaching several thousand subscribers. Within 5, it was something closer to a periodical of record for the charismatic renewal movement in Canada. Carrying testimonies from across the country, documenting healings in a way that took the evidentiary concerns of skeptics seriously, providing theological reflection on the question of miraculous gifts in a way that was neither credulous nor dismissive, and quietly building a network of ministers who otherwise had no connection to each other. This publication outlasted Elijah Marsh's ministry by decades. Marsh himself, and this too is part of the record, did not finish well in the conventional sense. In the late 1930s, personal failures became public. There were financial irregularities, and then there were the other kinds of irregularities that accumulate around men who have spent too long in the light, and not enough time, in the place Thomas Drummond had been going every morning since 1920. Marsh's public ministry effectively ended in 1938. The damage to the broader movement's reputation was real and substantial. Thomas did not abandon him. He also did not defend the indefensible. He wrote about the situation in The Witness with a precision that some found too honest and others found not honest enough, which is usually the sign that honesty has actually been achieved. He continued corresponding with Marsh personally until Marsh's death in 1947. He visited him when he could. He sent money from his own very modest resources when Marsh had none. He was asked about this once by a younger minister who was struggling to understand why a man of Thomas's integrity would maintain that kind of loyalty to a man who had so publicly compromised everything Thomas had worked for. Thomas thought about the question for a moment. "I didn't follow Elijah Marsh," he said. "I followed what was moving through him, and what was moving through him was real. Whatever he did afterward, the river doesn't stop being the river because the banks flood." The work Thomas had set in motion did not slow down when Marsh's ministry ended. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it, because Thomas had always been building for after, not for during. The network of ministers connected through The Witness continued meeting, continued corresponding, continued doing the work of follow-up discipleship that Thomas had identified as the critical gap 2 decades earlier. The documentation archive he had assembled became a resource for researchers and historians, and for the churches themselves, who needed to understand where they had come from in order to know where they were going. In 1944, Thomas and Clara established a small correspondence school for ministers in rural and remote communities across Canada, the Drummond Institute of Ministry. Though Thomas resisted naming it after himself for 3 years, and only relented when Clara pointed out that calling it something impersonal would make it harder to fundraise for. The school operated by mail. Students sent in their work. Thomas and a small team of volunteers, ministers he had nurtured through the Witness network, sent back feedback, reading assignments, theological reflection. It cost almost nothing to run. It reached men and women preparing for ministry in communities that no seminary would ever serve. Thomas was 57 years old when the institute launched. He was up at 4 in the morning to run it. He would be up at 4 in the morning for the rest of his life. The years that followed were not dramatic. They were something better than dramatic. They were faithful. The newsletter continued. The institute continued. The network continued. Thomas traveled less, as his health began the slow, incremental negotiations that health makes with age. But he wrote more. He wrote theological reflections, pastoral letters, practical guides for church administration in small and medium communities. The kind of work that does not get reviewed in prominent publications, and does not attract prominent readership, but sits on the shelves of thousands of small-town ministers and gets read at 3 in the afternoon when someone is trying to figure out how to do the next right thing. Clara died in 1961, quietly, in the stone farmhouse in Brantford that they had bought when they came back east in the 1940s. She had been unwell for 2 years. Thomas sat with her in her last hours and held her hand and said things that he did not say publicly and that are not recorded anywhere. He continued working the next morning, not because grief had left him, but because he understood that the work was the shape his love took in the world, and stopping the work would have been a diminishment of the love, not an expression of it. He died in 1969, in the same house at 82 years old. The cause of death was heart failure, which is perhaps simply the medical vocabulary for the fact that a heart can only hold so much for so long before it has to rest. At the time of his death, the Drummond Institute of Ministry had trained over 4,000 ministers in Canada and in the Caribbean communities where the witness had found its way through the mail routes of the early post-war years. The newsletter he had started on a mimeograph machine with a few hundred subscribers had a circulation, by 1969, of nearly 20,000. The documentation archive he had assembled, beginning in grain warehouses in Saskatchewan in 1920, was by then considered one of the most significant primary source collections of the charismatic renewal movement in the 20th century. Elijah Marsh's name appears in most histories of Canadian Pentecostalism. Thomas Drummond's name rarely does. This does not trouble us, as we tell it, because we suspect it would not have troubled him. He understood something that is very difficult to understand, which is that significance and visibility are not the same thing, and that the work that lasts is almost always the work that was done without an audience. The same 4 o'clock that Thomas kept in a borrowed room in Saskatchewan in 1920 is waiting to be kept today. The same gap between the fire of revival and the infrastructure of discipleship that he identified a century ago is still the gap that breaks most of what begins in the Spirit. The same quiet faithfulness that produced a network still functioning after his death is available to anyone willing to pay what Thomas paid in the hidden place. The currency of consistency, which is the most expensive currency there is because it must be spent every single morning, before sunrise, in a room where no one is watching. The miracles Thomas documented are in the archive. The ministers he trained are still preaching. The network he built is still holding, and the man himself is in a cemetery outside Brantford, Ontario, under a modest stone that gives his name and dates and nothing else, which is probably exactly what he would have wanted, and which is nowhere near enough.